The CIA director landed in Havana on Thursday. Photographs posted directly by the CIA on its own social media accounts showed John Ratcliffe sitting across a table from Ramon Romero Curbelo, the chief of intelligence of Cuba's Interior Ministry, with several other Cuban officials whose faces were deliberately blurred out. The CIA itself confirmed the visit. The Cuban government confirmed the visit. And the message that Ratcliffe carried from Donald Trump to the Cuban government was delivered with language that should alarm every person who has been paying attention to what America did to Venezuela 4 months ago. A CIA official told reporters that Ratcliffe traveled to Havana to tell Cuba that time was short and that Cuba needed to act immediately, and that if the regime dragged its feet, it might face the same fate as the government in Venezuela. The same fate as Venezuela. Delta Force at 2 a.m. A president pulled out of his own country in handcuffs. An announcement that America would run the country and take its oil. That is the fate the CIA director just told Cuba to avoid. By changing its government on American terms, or face the consequences. And while that warning was being delivered inside a meeting room in Havana, across the island, 11 million Cubans were living through blackouts of up to 22 hours a day, cooking with charcoal and wood because there is no electricity, protesting in the streets with pots and pans, shouting, "Turn on the lights," because Cuba has completely run out of oil. And the country that controls whether Cuba gets oil just sent its top spy to deliver an ultimatum. Here is the angle that makes this story the most underreported and most strategically significant development in the Western Hemisphere right now. The CIA has a history with Cuba that goes back to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and extends through decades of documented attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, some of which involved poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, and biological agents. The CIA and Cuba have spent 60 years as adversaries, and now the CIA director flew to Havana personally, not a diplomat, not a State Department official, not a special envoy, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he delivered an ultimatum. The symbolism of that specific choice, of all the officials Trump could have sent, is not subtle. It says something very specific about how the Trump administration categorizes this situation. Not as a diplomatic problem, not as a trade problem, not even as a human rights problem, as an intelligence and national security problem. The same category in which Venezuela was placed before Delta Force operators built a mock-up of Maduro's safe house and rehearsed the operation until it was perfect. And Ratcliffe met not with Cuba's foreign minister, not with Cuba's president. He met with Raúl Rodriguez Castro, the grandson of Raúl Castro. The same Raúl Castro who the Justice Department is simultaneously preparing to indict on charges of ordering the shoot-down of civilian aircraft in 1996. The same Raúl Castro who at 94 years old remains the most powerful figure in Cuba. The grandfather is being indicted in Miami. The grandson received the CIA director in Havana. That is not diplomacy. That is a vice being tightened from two directions simultaneously. To understand exactly what is happening in Cuba right now, you need to understand the full timeline of how this crisis was deliberately engineered. Cuba's energy crisis did not begin with Trump's second term. It began years earlier as a result of collapsed Venezuelan oil subsidies, aging infrastructure, hurricane damage, and the accumulated weight of 6 decades of American sanctions. But the situation that exists today, blackouts of 22 hours in Havana, complete depletion of diesel and fuel oil, hospitals running on emergency generators, food rotting in markets without refrigeration, is a direct result of specific decisions made by the Trump administration since January 2026. The first decision was Venezuela. When Delta Force captured Nicolas Maduro on January 3, 2026, and the United States announced it would run Venezuela and take its oil, the immediate consequence for Cuba was catastrophic. Cuba had been receiving approximately 45,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day under a decades-old arrangement where Cuba provided doctors and security personnel to Venezuela in exchange for subsidized crude. That arrangement ended the moment American forces took control of Caracas. The Venezuelan oil flow to Cuba stopped almost immediately, and Cuba had no alternative supply large enough to compensate. The second decision was the blockade. Trump imposed a blockade barring all foreign oil from reaching Cuba and threatening heavy tariffs against any country that provides Havana with fuel. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who had been an important alternative oil supplier for Cuba, faced the threat of American tariffs if she continued. Mexico had to pull back. Russia provided some short-term relief. A Russian-flagged tanker delivered 730,000 barrels of crude, a lifeline that Cuba's energy minister described as having now completely run out. Only one Russian tanker has successfully gotten through the blockade. The Strait of Hormuz closure from the Iran war complicated efforts to import fuel through other routes. And the United States has increased military and intelligence reconnaissance flights around Cuba to monitor the situation and prepare for what officials describe as a larger U.S. military buildup in the region. Cuba is 90 miles from the coast of Florida, and it is being systematically starved of energy while the world's attention was focused on Beijing and Tehran. Cuba's energy minister, Vicente de la O. Levy, stood before cameras on Wednesday, May 13, 2026, and said words that no energy minister of any country has ever said publicly in modern memory about their own nation's fuel reserves. He said, "We have absolutely no fuel oil, absolutely no diesel, zero. Not low, not critically low, absolutely zero." He said blackouts in Havana now exceed 20 to 22 hours per day, 22 hours without electricity, in the capital city of a country of 11 million people. The energy minister also said that Cuba's energy system is in a critical state. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel posted on X the same day and described the situation as particularly tense. He blamed the United States directly. He wrote that the dramatic worsening has a single cause, the genocidal energy blockade to which the United States subjects our country, threatening irrational tariffs against any nation that supplies us with fuel. The word he used was genocidal, and United Nations experts agreed with his framing, if not his word choice. UN human rights experts warned last week that the American blockade amounted to energy starvation, and said essential services had been pushed to the brink, and that this could violate the human right to food, health, and an adequate standard of living. That is the United Nations, not a political organization, saying that America's fuel blockade of Cuba may constitute a violation of international human rights law. And the response from Washington was to send the CIA director. On the same day that Ratcliffe was meeting with Cuban officials, and on the same day that the CIA visit was being photographed and confirmed, the Trump administration offered Cuba $100 million in humanitarian aid. $100 million to help the population deal with the crisis that the American blockade caused. But the offer came with conditions. Cuba must agree to meaningful reforms to receive the money. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Padilla rejected the characterization of what Washington offered. He accused Washington of lying about the assistance. Rubio responded by blaming the Cuban regime for not distributing the aid. But Díaz-Canel posted on Thursday that any American aid will encounter no obstacles or ingratitude from Cuba. Both sides were publicly contradicting each other about whether a humanitarian aid offer had been made and rejected or accepted. And, in the background, the DOJ was preparing to indict a 94-year-old former president. The sequencing of all of this, blockade first, CIA visit second, humanitarian offer third, indictment announcement planned for Cuban Independence Day, May 20th, is not random. It is a coordinated pressure campaign designed to make the Cuban government choose between fundamental political transformation on American terms or continuing collapse that eventually produces the popular uprising the Trump administration is betting on. Now let us talk about the indictment of Raúl Castro, because this is the development that most resembles what happened to Maduro before the Venezuela operation. In January 2026, Trump cited criminal charges against Maduro as the legal justification for his capture and removal to the United States to face trial. The Maduro indictment, filed years before his capture, became the legal architecture that allowed the administration to frame a military operation against a sitting head of government as law enforcement. Now, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida are building cases against top Cuban officials. U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Jason Redding Quiñones, created a working group of prosecutors and federal law enforcement specifically to build these cases. The potential indictment of Raúl Castro, for his alleged role as defense minister in ordering the shoot-down of 2 civilian aircraft operated by the Miami-based exile group Brothers to the Rescue in February 1996, was expected to be announced at a public event in Miami on May 20th, 2026. May 20th is considered Cuban Independence Day. Charging a former Cuban head of state on Cuban Independence Day in Miami in front of the Cuban exile community that has been pushing for this moment for 30 years is an act of political theater calibrated to maximum domestic effect. 4 members of Brothers to the Rescue died when Cuban military jets shot down their planes over what Cuba claimed was its airspace and the United States claimed was international waters. The families of those 4 men have waited 30 years for accountability. Their grief is genuine. Their desire for justice is legitimate. But the timing of the indictment, announced simultaneously with the CIA visit to Havana, a fuel blockade that has left 11 million people without electricity for 22 hours a day, and explicit warnings of Venezuela-style regime change, transforms a legitimate criminal case into a tool of geopolitical pressure. And Cuban exile leader Ramon Saúl Sánchez captured the contradiction precisely when he said, "That's a good step, but at the same time, it doesn't reconcile, politically speaking, that they are trying to engage with a regime at the same time that they are trying to indict their leader. You cannot simultaneously negotiate with a government and indict its most powerful former leader, unless you are not actually trying to negotiate, unless the negotiation is a formality and the indictment is the real message." The Donroe Doctrine that foreign policy named as the framework for all of this is worth explaining. It is Trump's updated version of the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 American policy that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonialism and established America as the dominant power in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine has been invoked to justify American intervention in Latin America for 2 centuries. Trump's Donroe Doctrine is its 21st century version. Venezuela was the first application. Cuba appears to be the second, and it is built on a simple strategic logic. Russia and China have established intelligence and military presences in Cuba that Trump views as unacceptable threats 90 miles from Florida. Trump accused Russia and China of operating intelligence posts in Cuba in January 2026. Both denied it. But Trump has increased American military reconnaissance flights around the island in preparation for what officials describe as a larger American military buildup in the region. The nuclear submarine USS Abraham Lincoln, the world's largest aircraft carrier, has been positioned near Cuban waters. Trump said earlier this month that the United States could almost immediately take over Cuba once the aircraft carrier approaches and forces officials to give up. Take over. Those 2 words again. The same vocabulary he used about Venezuela. And Rubio framed the strategic logic with the clarity of a man who has personal history with this issue. He said, "What is happening in Cuba is unacceptable. and it is a threat to the United States to have a failed state 90 miles from our coast. A failed state. The same language used about Venezuela before the operation began. The international reaction to the Cuba crisis has been notably more muted than the reaction to Venezuela, partly because the Iran war is consuming global diplomatic attention, partly because Cuba's government has few international defenders beyond Russia and China. But 30 House Democrats signed a letter urging the Trump administration not to take military action on Cuba and to lift the blockade. And the UN human rights experts, whose statement described the blockade as energy starvation, are a signal that the international community is watching. Mexico, which has been one of Cuba's most important diplomatic and economic partners, is in a bind. Trump's tariff threats against any country that provides Cuba with oil have effectively made it too economically costly for Mexico to help. And Mexican President Sheinbaum, who is simultaneously trying to manage the fallout from Trump's Venezuela operation and avoid provoking American military action on Mexican territory over the cartel assassinations, does not have the political leverage to openly defy the American blockade. Now the three scenarios for what happens next in Cuba. The first scenario is Cuba makes a deal, faced with the combination of complete fuel depletion, 22-hour blackouts, popular protests, CIA ultimatums, Raúl Castro's indictment on Cuban Independence Day, and the explicit threat of a Venezuela-style operation. The Cuban government finds a way to make enough concessions to satisfy Washington's minimum requirements for meaningful reforms. The United States releases the $100 million in humanitarian aid. The fuel blockade is partially eased. Some Russian tankers are allowed through. The blackouts become shorter. The protests diminish. And a process of Cuban political and economic opening begins, slowly, incompletely, and under enormous American pressure, that eventually produces a Cuba that is less closed than before, without necessarily producing the full regime change that Trump has said is his goal. This scenario requires the Cuban government to accept humiliations that its leadership has resisted for 6 decades. But the alternative scenarios may be worse. The second scenario is the CIA ultimatum fails and the operation begins. Cuba refuses to make meaningful reforms. The blackouts continue. The protests grow. The indictment of Raúl Castro is announced in Miami on May 20th. The Cuban government responds with defiance. The USS Abraham Lincoln maneuvers closer to Cuban waters. And Trump, who already did exactly what everyone said he would never do in Venezuela, orders an operation. Not necessarily a full-scale military invasion, possibly a targeted strike on specific infrastructure, possibly a Delta Force operation against specific leadership targets, possibly a naval blockade enforcement action that escalates into something larger. The exact form is uncertain, but the architecture of the approach, indictment first, ultimatum second, operation third, follows the Venezuela template precisely, and Trump has already demonstrated he will execute that template. The third scenario is Cuba becomes a failed state that implodes without direct American intervention. The fuel runs out completely, hospitals lose backup power, food distribution collapses, the protests that are currently loud but manageable become larger and more violent. The Cuban security forces face the choice between brutally suppressing a population that is genuinely suffering and allowing political change to occur. If Cuba implodes from within, Trump gets his regime change without the international condemnation of direct military action. And he gets to say that Cuba collapsed because communism failed, not because America starved it of fuel. That is perhaps the most cynical scenario, but it is also the one that allows Washington the most plausible deniability. I want to be completely direct about what I think is happening in Cuba right now. The CIA director visiting Havana to deliver a message that says, "Change or face Venezuela's fate." On the same day that Cuba announced it has zero fuel and zero diesel and 22-hour blackouts. On the same day that the Justice Department was preparing to indict a 94-year-old former president is not diplomacy.